Torgarmah, son of Gomer, Haplogroup J, and the Turks. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. Let's take a look at Togarmah, who is the son of Gomer. There's a belief that Torgarmah was the ancestor of Central Asians and Turkic tribes. This is according to both Jewish, Muslim, and Christian writers. Togarmah is among the descendants of Japheth and is thought to represent some people located in Anatolia. Togarmah in the Jewish tradition linked the Turkic peoples. Georgian traditions claim that Togarmah is the ancestor of Georgians. However, modern historians record that the Georgians are descendants of the Tubal. When speaking about Togarmah, some sources believe that not only Turks but also Armenian people are descendants of Togarmah. Togarmah is listed in Genesis chapter 10, verse 3, as the third son of Gomer and grandson of Japheth, brother of Ashkenaz and Riphath. The name is again mentioned in the book of Ezekiel as a nation from the far north. Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 6 mentions Togarmah together with Tubal as supplying soldiers to the army of Gog. Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 14 mentions Togarmah together with Tubal, Javan, and Meshech as supplying horses to the Thracians. Most scholars identify Togarmah with the capital city called Togarmah by the Hittites and Tilgarmuya by the Assyrians. O.R. Gurney placed Togarmah in southeast Anatolia. Several later ethnological traditions have claimed Togarmah as the mythical ancestor of various peoples located in Western Asia and the Caucasus. Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and the Christian theologians Jerome and Eudorus of Sevilla regarded Togarmah as the father of the Persians. Several ancient Christian authors, including Saint Hippolytus, Eusebius of Caesarea, and Bishop Theodoret, regarded him as a father of Armenians. Medieval Jewish traditions link him with Turkic peoples, including the Khazars. So, dealing with Jewish traditions, Togarmah was linked to medieval Turkic peoples by Jewish Khazar traditions. The Khazar ruler Joseph ben Aaron writes in his letters, and there's his letter, but I'm not going to read it. But he says, then he goes on to enumerate 10 names that can be identified as contemporary tribes living near the Black and Caspian Seas: Ugur, Tayor, Avar, Oghuz, Khazar, and Bulgar. And in his letter, he basically talks about how they are the descendants of these Turkic peoples are the descendants of Togarmah. I suppose I can read it. It says, you ask us also in our epistles of what people, of what family, and of what tribe are you? Know that we are descended from Japhet through his son Togarmah. I have found in the genealogical books of my ancestors that Torgarmah had 10 sons. And so let's read some more rabbinical works. So this is another medieval rabbinical work, the book of Jasher, that also covers Togarmah's descendants being Turks. There's Bulzar, who is believed to be the Khazars. You have the Parzinek, which is the peach eggs, and then you have the Ilicanim, which is the Alans, the Bulgar, which is the Bulgars, and I'm just going to name some of the Turkic tribes that you all might be familiar with. You have the Tarki, which is the Turks. You have the Bid, which is the Oghuz, and you have the Ungels, which is the Hungarians, and this is the medieval Jewish Josephus Ben Gurion lists the 10 sons of Torgarmah in his Juliuspan as follows. There's Khazar, which is the Khazars, of course. Then you have the Ali Konzok, which is the Alans. And you have the Turqui, which is the Turks. You have the Buz, which is the Oghuz. You have the Ugaris, which is the Hungarians. Just again, naming a few of these peoples. And then you have in the Chronicles of Jaramel, you have the Khazar, which is the Khazars again. You have the Alans, the Bulgars, the Turks, the Turks, the Buz, the Oghuz, the Uyghurs, the Hungarians, and really a lot of these Turkic tribes typically are the same, which is pretty good in all things considered. In the 11th century Arabic translation of Jesfan by a Yemenite Jew, Togarmah's tribes are these Khazars, Alans, and basically a lot of the tribes that I just named. So now what's interesting about these claims is that some Christian scientists of a young Earth perspective actually believe that Haplogroup J was part of Turkic tribes and a Turkic migration into Europe and the Middle East. So we're actually going to play this clip that actually deals with this. This is from Answers in Genesis, if you want to find the video, titled, Can We Identify the Jews Genetically? It's a pretty decent video, so let's actually begin. Before I play the clip, I want to make it known that I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching purposes as well as research purposes. I am protected under Title 17 USC Section 107. Again, this is a copyright disclaimer. I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching and research purposes.
What is the explanation, though, for this group J that seems to have a bullseye concentration in the Middle East? Could there still be something here that's related to the Jews? Surprisingly, one of the keys to understanding the history of this lineage comes from a study that didn't even sample the Middle East. This first study we looked at early on in these episodes, the 1,000 Genomes Project, the one that sampled the major locations of where the people are, didn't even have lineages in the Middle East. Yet it did have members of Group J. And this was historically in my own study of the Y chromosome, one of the first studies I examined and one of the first puzzles I had trouble solving. Group J in this study is heavily populated by, if you can just see the colors here, gold and green, Europeans and peoples of South Asia. We'll zoom in here just momentarily so you can see them. Yes, you have peoples in the Americas, but again, I think this is carryover from Europe. Sadly, most Latin Americans have European ancestry, not indigenous American, because the die-off of these peoples after the arrival of Columbus. So even though they're gray here, Native American, so-called Latin American, actually this should be gray as well, this Colombian. But for that matter, we could color them all likely gold as well because they're of European descent. So you have this European/American group here. You can see Colombians, Italians from Tuscany, Finnish peoples. Then you have some of the South Asians, Pakistanis, Gujaratis who are living in Houston but trace their ancestry to India, Punjabis, Bengalis from Bangladesh, Indian Telugus, so forth. That's the major groups here in this group J, because these are the peoples that were sampled. British person here as well, Sri Lankans. That's what you find here in group J. And I want to zoom back out so that you can see part of the big picture pattern here, and a pattern that really stumped me when I first saw it. So this may be small at the screen you're looking at, but if you try to squint and see the colors, you'll see that there's a general grouping of gold/gray. And I'm going to lump the gray in with the gold, basically a European subgroup here, and then an Indian, South Asian subgroup here, and then another European subgroup here, and an Indian. They kind of alternate. They're not all intertwined. It's like there was a group that went off this direction and then off this direction. They share a common ancestor back here, but it's like whatever population they came from went their separate ways and stayed in Europe or stayed in South Asia thereafter. These clusters have common ancestors in the 700s to 1100s. And early on in my study of the Y chromosome, I thought, what in the world is this? Is this now evidence against the Y chromosome clock? I can't think of anything that connects these sections of the world together. And then I came across this study, the one we just mentioned, that has samples of the Middle East. And you can see in red here, there's a lot of red. I'm like, okay, finally, this is the explanation. This must be why Europe and India are connected. The connection must run through the Middle East. And the geography of J, or at least the fact that it runs through the Middle East, reminded me immediately of the Islamic conquests, beginning in the 600s AD with Muhammad and his followers, and eventually spread through North Africa, got into Europe. You can see it extends to the edge of India, is in Pakistan. Aha, this seems to fit then these clusters. But then I got stuck on the dates again as I looked into this history more so. Yes, Muhammad and his followers, and the people thereafter, these Arab Muslims, got as far east and west as is shown here. But by the mid-800s, the eastern part of their empire began to be reconquered by Central Asian peoples. So that by the mid-800s, this part of the Islamic empire was being cut off from India. And before the time of Columbus, the 1100s, the Muslims were being pushed out of Spain. So if we're getting cut off here in the 800s from South Asia, how in the world do you connect this part of the world to this part of the world up into the 1100s? This is where I began to scratch my head again. Now what? How do you explain this? What's the history of Group J? How do you connect Europe and India? In fact, it turns out that this Europe-India connection was one of the keys to unraveling the surprising explanation for Group J, and by extension, a good chunk of the Jewish population in the world today. Let's go back to India, because this is where one of the keys to understanding it emerges. And let's work through the history of India from the present, working backwards. So the modern Indian state traces its origins to the 20th century, where they throw off British rule. So you step back from the modern Indian state and you run into the British Raj, which rules on from the 1800s onwards. They're here because the East India Company arrives in the 1600s. They arrive not to a British Raj, obviously, but to the Mughal Empire. And we discussed in previous episodes that the Mughal Empire comes from the Persian word for Mongol, because this is of Mongol origin. Well, that's intriguing. However, neither of these historical events seems to be a good explanation for the connection between India and Europe. For one, hardly any British peoples are in this J grouping, so that doesn't seem to fit. And the Mongols, even though we've already seen connections between Europe and South Asia due to the Mongols, the dates seem to be too late. Well, who precedes the Mughals? Mughals are preceded, at least in North India, by the Delhi Sultanate. By the name, you might start to think some sort of Muslim-Islamic connection. Ethnically, though, if you look at history books, this is not Arab Muslim in origin. It's, if anything, led by an Iranian-type people, but the history books will talk about the Turkish invasion of India, because many of the members of these armies, as well as some of the Arab armies, were manned by slaves. In Egypt especially, there were slaves who were being enlisted in the Muslim armies. And in the Iranian leadership, leading to the Delhi Sultanate, there were massive numbers of Turks as part of this army. And so history books will talk about the Turkish invasion of India that gave rise to the Delhi Sultanate. Well, 1200s, this is now much closer to the dates that are relevant. And what's even more intriguing is it's the Turks that are responsible for pushing the Arab Muslims back towards the Middle East. It's the Seljuk Turks who in the thousands AD are overrunning the Middle East. Now, if you're like me, you hear Turks and you think modern day Turkey. Their origins are actually here in Central Asia, and this history is part of the explanation for how they got to Turkey. This is 1000s AD, and again, a different group of Turks is now coming down into India 100 or so years later. So this split between these eventual Turkish peoples and those who come into India happens right around 1100 AD. Turks don't stay in the Middle East, though. They're overrun within a century or two by the world's greatest empire, the Mongols. Notice, though, that even though the Mongols skirt India and essentially cut off this part of the world from India, and of course conquer much of Central Asia, get into Eastern Europe, get into the Middle East, they don't quite conquer all of Turkey, and the Turkish peoples persist in Western Turkey. And in fact, they throw off the Mongols and begin to reconquer again, and last for several hundred years under the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which rules, notice here, parts of Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, they're in the Middle East, parts of North Africa, and they're in both Middle East and in Europe for several hundred years. They're in one or the other for longer than this. Of course, they're in Turkey in the 1300s. Notice, though, that they're in the Middle East into the 1900s. Think back to history that might be more familiar. World War I, they're one of the World War I powers, the Ottoman Empire down here. You can see some of the other, perhaps more familiar entities during World War I up in this map. My point is the highlight here, Turkish people here right into the modern era, and they're connecting Europe down here. And the connection of the Turkish people to India goes back to the split between the Seljuks and whoever these other Turkish people were going back in the Delhi Sultanate back in the 1100s. So notice how the realm of the Ottoman Empire getting down into the Middle East, and again, this is eventually cut off. Go back to the previous slide here. You can see how much it's decreased by the 1900s, but it's still extending down here to the Middle East. This is a very intriguing geographic echo in the concentration of Group J in the Middle East and elsewhere today. The Ottoman Empire seems to explain the concentration today, and the history of the Turks seems to explain why we can have connections here and here, and the lack of a heavy Turkish presence in either of these places in recent history might explain why it's such a low concentration there. It fits the timing of the splits in these clusters, and here's how, just to make it clearer why. Why would there be a Turkish connection to Europe in the 700s? Because I said there's some clusters here that separate in the 700s. Well, recall from previous episodes that there's a steady stream of Central Asian peoples into Europe from the 500s, 700s, and one of the 700s peoples is a Turkish group. The Oghuz peoples moving from Central Asia into Europe are Turkish peoples. They're not the only Turkish peoples. There are Turkish people who stuck around Central Asia and became then part of the Turkish armies that came into India. These are not the only Turkish people. There was a split between whoever these people were and the Seljuk Turks in the thousands. So that would explain the 1100 split as they go this way. These other Seljuk Turks go this way. And these two groups are separated by the arrival of the Mongols. And those who persist in modern-day geographic Turkey expand after the arrival and throw off the Mongol yoke and have this empire that persists in the Middle East up until the modern time. So let's watch this history again with one map to make it even clearer, because the Turkish peoples, in my view, are the best explanation at present for this Group J, not Arab Muslims. So these peoples, even though I think Turkish peoples as here. Yet history, their origin is not there. It's in Central Asia in the 600s. Turkish people arise in Central Asia in the 600s. Some of these people begin migrating to Europe in the 700s. which is why I think we see some of the echo in the splits between Europeans and Indian peoples at that point in time. There's another split that happens, the Seljuk Turks, which give rise then to the modern Turkish peoples around the thousands. But there's still Turkish peoples left over. The split happens in the thousands, and those who are still left over move down then and are invading, part of the armies that invade India in the 1200s. I mentioned the last episode talking about the Vikings, that there's this general rule of thumb that seems to emerge in the human family tree, that last empire standing wins. Yes, you might invade and take over, but if there's some people group that comes in after you and then wipes you out, they're the group that's going to be dominant today. So, yes, they arrive in Europe in the 700s, but there's many other peoples who arrive after them. So they're a minority of European peoples today. The peoples in India, we saw that the Delhi Sultanate is followed by the Mughal Empire, the Mongols. And so they're not the last empire standing. They're a minority of India today. Even the Seljuk Turks, as they pass through the Middle East, are not the last empire standing. The Mongols march through here, and after the Mongols are other Iranian peoples who then rise. And so they're not the major grouping in this part of the world today, not even in the Middle East, because the Turkish people here are followed by the Mongol conquest. So the Turks are pushed into modern-day geographic Turkey as a result of the Mongol conquest, but then they begin reconquering again and become the last empire standing in other parts of the world. They move into Europe, but eventually pushed back out. They move into parts of North Africa, and perhaps more importantly for our study, they're in the Middle East for several centuries, right up until the modern era, when the modern Muslim countries, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, emerge today. This history of the Turks seems to find a very strong echo, the geographic extent of Group J today. So who are the Jews? Who are modern-day Jewish people? Well, it seems that a section, I should say, a subsection of modern Jews, along with many other Middle Eastern peoples, and some Europeans, like Greeks and other Balkan Peninsula folks, and Italians, and even some Spaniards at a low percentage, and even some Indians, all share a common Turkish heritage. They trace some of their origins to Central Asia. Not all of these people, but if you're in the Middle East, a heavy percentage of you do trace your origins via Group J to the Turkish people. And what we've seen in this episode is, once again, Central Asia seems to play this dominant role in the world history of peoples. We've seen other Central Asian lineages, R1A, R1B, due to Mongols, Magyars. But here the Turkish people are showing up in the Middle East. They have a dominant presence. They're about a quarter of the peoples in India. The fingers of Central Asia, even though they don't necessarily occupy much attention in the history of Western civilization, politically they don't play a huge role in Europe, but in terms of their DNA, massive echo in Europe, in the Middle East, significant imprint in India, and even now in North Africa.
I think it's very interesting seeing the parallels that Dr. Nathaniel Jansen has come up with when it comes to his model, Haplogroup J being Turkic tribes and Turkic tribes descending from Togarmah, as we read earlier. Therefore, Togarmah would be Haplogroup J, in this sense. Togarmah. Here's just a simple biblical map showing the distribution of Togarmah's descendants, them going into Central Asia and even going into Anatolia and the Balkans of southern Europe. And so there is this very strong understanding of Togarmah's descendants being Turkic and Central Asian peoples. And when we look at Haplogroup J, you can link it up with various Turkic tribes and Turkic peoples spread throughout Europe and Eurasia. When you look at the different tribes of people, they do overlap. If you want to take this route as well, a more Turkic route for Haplogroup J. With all that being said, I'm not saying I completely agree or disagree with this view, but I believe it's just something interesting to share with you guys when I came across this. I think you should at least know about it, even if I don't completely agree or disagree. But There are other views and perhaps better views on the subject of which son haplogroup J could belong to, as well as better ways to prove haplogroup J belonging to Torgarmah, if this is so. But with that being said, this is where we end Torgarmah, son of Gomer, haplogroup J, and the Turks. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, click the bell, and share the video. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I'll try to answer it. And follow my social media accounts that I mentioned at the beginning of the video so that you can contact me. And also, don't forget, have a great day and shalom.